this computer. Okay, so that's good. Um, Hello, everyone, again. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Suresh Kimire. I am vegetable specialist with Yukon Extension. We're glad to have you here for this webinar on practical strategies to improve farm profitability. A special thanks to our speakers today. Um, we have three excellent speakers who bring valuable experience from both financial and production side of things. And each speaker will tentatively speak for 15 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. But feel free to enter your questions as we go in the chat. Those will be addressed at the end. My colleagues here, Evan Lenz, who is fruit specialist, and I'll be monitoring chat. As you see here, we are a team, and we'll make sure everything will be addressed as time permits. And at the end of this webinar, there will be a short survey, very short, like 2 to 3 minutes. And your feedback is very important to us. So please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Chris Lawton. Chris is the Director of Knowledge Exchange at Farm Credit East. Chris works closely with farmers across the Northeast on financial management, business planning, and decision-making tools that support long-term farm profitability. Today, he will share insights of key financial concepts and approaches to holistic farm planning. Chris, take it away.
Okay, great. If you can give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen.
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, great. So today we're going to talk about farm enterprise management, and we'll go into much more detail into what that means and how that's defined. First, I want to begin with just a very brief introduction to Farm Credit East for those of you that may not be aware of us, who we are and what we do. Farm Credit East is part of the National Farm Credit System, which serves all 50 states and Puerto Rico. And it's made up of about 55 independent farmer-owned cooperatives that have defined territories. So on the map, on the screen, you can see the map of Farm Credit East service area. It's the 6 New England states, New York and New Jersey. Our core business is loaning money to farming, fishing, and forestry. We have 18,000 customers across the 8 states that we serve, and 23 offices. As I mentioned, we are a farmer-owned cooperative. We are owned by the customers we serve, and our earnings go back to our customers in the form of patronage dividends each winter. We have about $15 billion invested in Northeast farming, fishing, and forestry. And we are very committed to serving a diverse agricultural community, including all types of agriculture, all types of crops and livestock, as well as young, beginning, small, and veteran farmers. So with that, let's move on to enterprising your business. So what does that mean? So enterprising, basically, farm operations vary tremendously. Some operations may have only one product. You may grow, 25 acres of hay, and that's what you produce, and you sell it to a limited number of customers, and that's a very simple business model, and that's fine. But other farm businesses have very diverse business offerings. They may have multiple product categories that they sell. They may sell to multiple types of customers. They may have wholesale clients, retail clients. They may have some on-farm processing. They may sell items that they purchased for resale or co-products of their operation. So what enterprise analysis does is it's an attempt to kind of break out the farm's activities by categories that make sense. So, and I'll go into a case study in a minute, but you might break it out by client type. So you might have an enterprise for your wholesale business and an enterprise for your retail business. You might do it by product category. So maybe if you do vegetables and you also sell blueberries or something like that, those could each be their own enterprise. And why it matters is because it's typically very common for the enterprises in your business to perform differently and have different capital needs and different labor needs and operational expenses. And so it's important to be able to track the different activities of your business and look at the relative profitability and investment intensity that each of those enterprises has. So the goal is to provide a farm manager with accurate information concerning a particular part of their business. So you could segregate the key revenue generators in your business, and then you want to develop accurate financial statements and try to allocate costs between enterprises, especially cost centers. Usually it's easier to segregate the revenue than it is to segregate the costs, because sometimes costs, especially overhead and labor, are often commingled. Particularly in a smaller enterprise, a smaller farm that has multiple enterprises, one employee may work across 2 or 3 enterprises, and how to divvy up their labor can be a challenge. But we'll talk about that in a minute. So an example of just some different types of farms: you could have a single crop farm with one enterprise that has a net income of $100,000, which is wonderful. Or you could have a diversified operation that has a net income of the same amount, but it's broken down into 4 enterprises. And you can see that 2 of them are quite profitable. One is just above break even, and one actually loses a little money. Which is better? Well, it depends. Certainly the management complexity is a lot more significant in that diversified operation. You have a lot more things to keep track of and manage. But it's also a risk management strategy, in that if one enterprise has a tough year, another one might do better and provide you with some resiliency in terms of your income. It can also provide resiliency in terms of your production risk. If you're producing different categories of products, the risk of customers, if you're selling to multiple types of customers. So it can help with risk management. And the other thing too is that, especially in an economy like New England, sometimes it's hard to have a single enterprise business because there's just not enough of one thing to do. So it makes sense to diversify and serve different markets. But there's no like rule of thumb as to like how many enterprises is the right amount. It's really, each operation is a little different. It's kind of whatever works. So allocating costs is usually the biggest challenge with enterprising. And the reason why is that not all expenses are easily attributed to a product. Particularly overhead, you want to divide your overhead in a way that makes sense, is manageable, meaning that it doesn't require that much time on your part, and it's fair to your enterprises. And again, we'll get into that. And then labor that works in multiple departments can be a challenge as well. There's always some I have trouble speaking here, some subjectivity that's always involved, but it's important to be sort of fair and realistic to your different enterprises, because inappropriate allocations can give inaccurate results and make a specific part of your business look worse than it might really be. So you want to be kind of fair in applying your overhead burden. So parts of enterprising are looking at your profit centers, looking at your revenue generators. These are usually easy to identify, but what is included matters. Try to do it in ways that are sort of natural breaks in your business. In my personal background, I came from a greenhouse nursery business in Eastern Massachusetts, not far from Boston. And we had nursery production, greenhouse production, a retail garden center, a retail florist, and we had a wholesale sales area where we sold to the landscape trade. And so each one of those main kind of boxes, if you will, were enterprises, and it was fairly complex to track costs across those. But it was important because we looked at with that many kind of major activities in our business, it was important to really figure out, which enterprises are doing well, which are doing mediocre, which might be doing poorly, and how we can optimize each one, and where to invest our limited capital, because there's always more capital demands than there is money to invest in your business. So you want to do it in the area that meets the needs of your business, but also is going to generate the most return for yourself. Cost centers, we already talked about that it can be harder to separate costs, but you want to certainly, any direct expenses, allocate them to each enterprise. And then we'll talk about overhead in a minute. So as an example, let's look at, a theoretical business, Chris's Orchards. So this business has orchard growing. They grow tree fruit. They have a farm stand where they sell, and they sell some of their tree fruit at wholesale. But then they have a farm stand where they sell the bulk of their fruit at retail to walk-in customers. They sell products that they grow themselves, and they also sell purchased products as well. Then in the farm stand, they have a bakery also. And the bakery is worth breaking out because it's fairly significant in both revenue and costs. And it consumes a fair amount of capital in terms of the investment in personnel and equipment. So this business, we're going to break it into 3 enterprises, and we'll look at those in a minute. So to break out expenses for orchard growing, obviously orchard workers that are dedicated to the orchard, we put in that bucket. Most of the farm equipment goes in there, irrigation, supplies used. And then for the overhead, we sort of are going to assign it a land rental that it's being assessed, if you will. For the farm stand, we have retail employees that are dedicated to the farm stand business. We have store expenses, resale items, the wholesale cost of fruit from the orchard. So what we're going to do is we're going to transfer fruit from the growing enterprise to the farm stand and sort of allocate the wholesale value of that fruit back to the orchard enterprise. So it gets credit for the fruit that's being sold through the farm stand. And then for overhead, we're counting store utilities, advertising, some other things in that bucket. And then for the bakery, we're going to count the purchased ingredients because it buys flour and other ingredients, flour, sugar, etc. The bakery staff, the wholesale fruit cost, and then for its revenue, because the bakery doesn't have any registers of its own, people go into the store, pick up items from the bakery, and then they go through the retail farm stand registers. So we'll discuss how that's allocated. And then for overhead, we're going to consider utilities for the bakery and a portion of the advertising because it's they're marketing to retail consumers. So what that looks like if we break it out is for revenue. The revenue, like I said, is usually fairly easy. The orchard has $70,000 per year in wholesale sales that it sells to a packer. The farm stand has $750,000, and the bakery has $20,000 because the sales from the bakery go through the farm stand registers, but they're keyed as a the items are coded to that the SKUs are coded to the bakery department. And then the $170,000 is what goes through the retail store. So we're breaking in with those internal purchases and allocating $170,000 in revenue to the bakery. The external, I misspoke earlier. The external sales are $20,000 in wholesale sales that the bakery makes. So that gives us a total revenue of $840,000. These internal sales cancel out. We don't want to count them twice. But basically, we're looking at the farm stand's internal purchases. So it's pulling fruit from the orchard, $100,000 worth of apples every year that are sold through the at wholesale value that are sold through the retail store, $170,000 for the bakery goods that are sold through there. So we're allocating back that inventory transfer, and then the bakery consumes about $5,000 worth of apples for like apple pies and turnovers and things. Then we break out supplies. We can see that we have some categories that are only for the orchard, crop expenses, equipment repairs. We track direct labor. And then for overhead, this is where it gets a little tricky. In this case, we're allocating it just as a portion of the total sales, internal and external, for each department. So that gives most of the overhead to the farm stand to bear, a smaller amount to the bakery, and then a medium amount to the orchard. When we factor in the overhead, the orchard actually, technically by our enterprise analysis, loses money, but the business overall across all three enterprises is fairly profitable. So now what to do about that? Well, it's good to know that the orchard is perhaps not being totally profitable, but the orchard is the core enterprise of the business overall. The farm stand and the bakery wouldn't work without the orchard, so there to produce the product. So I'm not saying that you get rid of the orchard, but it's important to recognize kind of where your bread is being buttered, so to speak, where your profit is coming from. So if I was going to invest money, I'd look at first where the payoff is going to be. If it's an efficiency investment for the orchard, maybe that makes sense to get that net profit turned to the positive. Maybe it makes sense to invest in the farm stand where the bulk of the profits are coming from. Those are management decisions that can be made, but it's good to consider the profitability and the cost and revenue profile of each of your major enterprises, because it helps you manage the business more precisely. So some enterprising tips: you want to, first of all, determine the need of doing it, and make the case to the staff for the required record keeping, because if you don't have buy-in from staff, you're not going to get good records and you won't be able to divide your expenses well. For capital purchases, you want to allocate costs by either the enterprise that uses them the most, or put an overhead and allocate in a way that makes sense. You want to keep it as simple as possible, or it's not going to work. Key things to make it work are tracking inventory transfers. That's really important. So in this case, I have an example of like an inventory control card you could have that the staff turn in at the end of the day. In this case, for transferring apples from the orchard to the farm stand, we can, have an inventory control card, and that can be used to allocate revenue from one enterprise to the other. And then allocating overhead in a way that's fair to the different departments, and then also making sure your labor is allocated properly. And that can be important for a number of reasons. One is just because labor, if they're doing multiple tasks, can be tough to divide, but also you have an impact of labor laws. For example, like in this enterprise where we have an orchard, a farm stand, and a bakery, the farm stand sells resale purchases. This $100,000 in external purchases. They're buying fruits and vegetables from neighboring farms to sell in the farm stand. So as soon as you start handling product that's not your own, you lose things like overtime exemption. So it's important to keep track of your employees separately, because you may have to treat them differently. The orchard, where it's purely production, these employees are most likely not required to pay overtime. You may, in my family's example, where we had the nursery production, the retail garden center, we paid overtime for our production employees anyway, because we didn't want to have a rift between different departments in the same company where some were treated differently than others. But if you are going to treat your things like overtime policies differently, you need to track your labor accordingly. So yeah, the tracking your inventory, your labor, and your overhead are the key things to enterprising your business and managing it with more precision. So you want to see what enterprises are more versus less profitable. factor in again how important is this enterprise to the overall business. What is the management time and capital needs? What's your vision and identity for the business? It's not always about the dollars and cents purely. It's often about what you want your business to look like, and what you want your life to look like. One of the great things about running a farm is that you get to define what success means for you in terms of business, but lifestyle as well. And it's also important for the enterprising to think about, can improvements be made to individual sectors of your business, individual enterprises. And so with that, I will turn it over to Will to talk about his experience in farm enterprising, and we'll go from there.
Thanks,
You
Chris.
stop sharing.
Let me try and get my screen shared here. All right, I'm just getting my window set up so I can still see you guys if you have questions and stuff along the way. So just give a quick intro real quick. I'm going to mostly be talking in the context of scaling up a relatively new farm and kind of scaling up with increasing profitability in mind. Compared to Chris's presentation, this will be a bit more qualitative as opposed to quantitative. Just a little quick background on our farm. We started in 2020 with a combined about 15 years of experience. When I say we, it's me and my wife, Jill, who are the owners and operators of the farm. We moved our farm 3 times in our first 3 years trying to find land, which is a big challenge and has definitely influenced the ways in which we've grown. And we scaled from about 1.5 acres in our first season to now growing about 8 acres between 2 parcels that we lease in Morris, Connecticut. We grow with organic practices. We're not yet certified, in part because of all the moving. And that's something that we may pursue down the line, but have not taken the plunge just yet. And we grow we're diverse in terms of crops. We grow about 40 different vegetable and herb crops, and we're also diverse in terms of how we market our produce. We do a lot of wholesale with local grocery stores, food hubs, and a handful of restaurants. And we do 2 farmers markets and have a small CSA that we operate out of our farm stand. Last year, our breakdown for those different enterprises was about 48% to our wholesale markets, 35% retail sales, 12% CSA, and then we have a small plant sale that we do in the spring that was about 5% of our revenue. So how did we choose our commodities that we're growing in our markets? I would say the biggest thing was that our experience in farming was, for me, it was almost entirely in vegetable growing. Jill had both a vegetable and a small fruit background, but we felt, especially with the land situation, didn't make sense to pursue any perennial crops. So that really drove our decision. And with our experience, I felt pretty confident that the market potential in the Northeast in general, and also in particular in Connecticut, is pretty huge. I feel like I've said this about 20 times in the last couple of weeks at conferences and stuff, but only about 2% of the food consumed here is grown here. So there's a lot of potential, and it may or may not require some creativity to figure out how you fit into that marketplace. As we've grown, we've kind of thought about additional enterprises we can add, and they need to fit in with what our primary focus is with the vegetables, and also they need to maybe add value in other ways, and I'll talk about that a bit more specifically, starting with this. So adding the plant sale, for example, was a really easy decision because it made use of greenhouse space that we were already heating and allowed us to add revenue early in the season, allowing us to bring employees along onto the crew faster and again, bolster our revenue at a time when the crops coming out of the field are pretty lean. So that's been a kind of the way that we've approached everything that we've added along the way. Um, other enterprises we've tried and have dropped because they haven't met our financial expectations or other expectations as far as labor and quality of life, to Chris's point. So we did cut flowers for 2 seasons, and I think cut flowers can be a very profitable enterprise for a lot of people. For us, with the vegetables as our main focus, we found ourselves, working until 10:30 p.m. doing arrangements and dealing with the flowers, and we're just barely breaking even on that enterprise. So that was one that we dropped in order to keep our efforts focused. Um, and then just want to mention that our focus on wholesale might be a little odd for our size, only 8 acres of production. But from our perspective, it's a really efficient use of our time. We're not standing at a farmer's market, 4 or 5 times a week for many hours and sending trucks down and maybe having product that comes back unsold. But this is a picture from, I think, last summer at the Northwest Connecticut Food Hub, where we're delivering food by the pallet at an affordable price and for a reasonable kind of exchange of labor to profitability from our perspective. I think part of how we've operated has also been a bit by chance. I have the bullet in here. COVID kind of led to some opportunities that set us on our path. Getting started in 2020, we got relationships with grocery stores and CSA customers maybe a lot faster than a startup farm typically would. And so there's a fair amount of flexibility that you need to be able to just pivot as an opportunity shows up. And this is a picture of our little farm stand here in Morris. That's another similar case where a CSA member who owns a wine shop here in town had this little building that was unused and kind of offered us to set up there. And it's at an intersection where about 10,000 cars go through every day. So opportunities can come up to improve your profitability, sell things close to the farm at a good price that you might not be expecting. So acquiring equipment and infrastructure is sort of the next chunk of things that I'm going to talk about. In our early years, we were really scrappy, basically only purchasing things that we could pay for with cash. This is a greenhouse frame we put up in our first year that we got used for like $350. Wouldn't necessarily recommend going that route since we had to have a bunch of parts made for it that we found out were missing along the way. But you do what you can. And similarly, we were operating all with this walk-behind tractor, similar to a BCS that we purchased with proceeds from our early CSA sales. As we've scaled up, we have wanted to prioritize our physical health. Doing things at that hand scale is hard on the body. And so, things that prioritize our health, systems that are functional and efficient, and then things that allow us to save labor. So, sometimes spending a little extra money, taking on the debt, can allow you to scale and grow those things faster. Same things goes for having, appropriately sized cold storage, so that you can, keep your inventory high quality and moving out of the farm, in a safe and efficient manner. And then like a lot of vegetable growers of our size, we do a lot of growing in high tunnels. We've had 2 for the past 3 seasons, and we just built 2 more in the fall that we'll be bringing into service this year. And again, it's kind of all about like how can we squeeze the most value out of a space with the resources that we have and the labor that we have. And there's another shot of the little greenhouse complex right in the middle of the farm. So a couple things here. As I said at the beginning, we're really debt averse. We have become less so along the way. We've, utilized farm credit, loans from families, other things like that to make those infrastructure and equipment improvements. But we've paid really close attention to our cash flow budgets and projections to make sure that we're not becoming over leveraged. So I think just having really good record keeping systems set up has been really critical in allowing us to decide when it's appropriate to, buy the new box truck or finance a tractor or whatever it is. And that's definitely something that I think people need to do early on. Um, and we're still a little bit scrappy. This is actually a picture from the farm I managed previously, but we do a lot of stuff kind of DIY. This is a germination chamber that I built, and we still do stuff like this all the time, rather than just, spending a ton of money on something new. Another case in point, a 1949 Allis-Chalmers G is the tool that we primarily use for weed control, and it's pretty inexpensive, easy to work on. We have the skills and experience to deal with a piece of equipment like this, and it's made for huge labor savings on the farm compared to when we were doing everything at that hand scale. Um, and we've relied really heavily on, as I said, our experience and skills, but also our network to make decisions about our investments in infrastructure and equipment. Before we bought this full-size tractor, I spent, a couple of hours on the phone with different farmers that I've worked for and people that I know, just kind of thinking about how to spec it out, how to, set up a system for tillage and planting and everything else that works for our farm. So that I think also needs to have an influence on these big financial decisions. Um, Land use. So, as I said, we moved the farm around a bunch. Um, in a funny way, we ended up back on the piece of land where we started and now have a long-term lease. So we're making some bigger investments in the land. And like a lot of farms, it's 112 acres, but it's really mixed terrain. We've got relatively flat prime farmland, and we've also got, big sloping fields that you can kind of see in the distance of this um, picture that aren't suitable for vegetable production. So we consider new enterprises and partnerships with other farmers in our area that will fit well. You can see that hay wagon. That's our neighbor who basically helps us maintain these fields and gets a crop out of it for himself, and that supports our farm by allowing us to focus on our production areas. Um, Separate from that, I think we have some other goals that influence how we're choosing enterprises on the farm. This is just a picture of a neighbor's orchard that I've helped to maintain over the last few years. Again, thinking about the skills and experience that we have. We're also working towards, creating an ecosystem on our farm that makes us more resilient to climate change, to bad crop years, as Chris said, sort of that risk management strategy. Um, so we are looking to this spring we're going to be planting an orchard with the hope of making this little cider hobby that we've had into something that can support the farm closer to year round. And along those lines, I think for us, one of our goals is not only to, um, make money on the vegetables, but also figure out ways that there's a workflow and a cash flow year round that can support both us and our crew, kind of moving away from that like seasonal employment that can be challenging for farms to deal with and farm workers to deal with. And then this is just another shot kind of where we're going. This is from a friend's farm in Massachusetts that's doing a lot of silvopasture. So, um, doing the hay, planting these crops is all towards like a more whole landscape management style, involving other farmers that can support the enterprises that we are relying on for our income. Last piece, and I'll be quick here. Why do we want to become more profitable? Well, for us, a big part of it is having a better sort of work-life balance. And so we both have a lot of interests outside of farming. And so sometimes those things can line up in a manner that supports the farm's overall viability. So this is a picture of we had a little art show and two bands playing a barn. I guess you could call this agritourism in a way. But it got a lot of people out to the farm, generated a modest amount of revenue, and kind of plays a marketing role in what we do. One of our goals is to kind of, I'll stay on that previous slide for a second, is to operate more like a quote unquote normal business. We would like for our employees to be here for a long time, to be in a professional environment, and to, expect the kind of benefits that come along with that, when possible, obviously. And we want the same for ourselves. We'd love to be able to, leave the farm for a week in the summer and not think that things are going to implode. Again, this is my wife Jill is also a painter, and this is a show that we just installed for her this past week. So how can things off the farm support our endeavors on the farm, and vice versa? It's kind of a bit of a give and take. And beyond that, I want to be able to stop farming at 4 in the summertime and go ride my bike. And that's going to both support like the ability to not just be full on working until it's dark every day, is I think going to make us better farmers in the long term, both in terms of our physical health, but our mental health and our ability to focus clearly on the task at hand when it comes to making big decisions on the farm. So I'll leave it there. Feel free to be in touch, and I will pass it off to Bruce.
Thank you. I will share Bruce's slides. How is it looking? Good? Yeah. Okay. Bruce.
All right.
Oh, it's present mode.
Okay, you're in that mode.
Good.
Well, hello everybody. Well, Suresh gets it set up. I'll introduce myself. I'm Bruce Grezik Jr. I'm a co-owner of Grezik Farms in New Hartford, Connecticut. I'm mostly going to focus on the diversification of our farm, and then why we choose to do what we do and when we choose not to do it. That's also important. I think Chris and both Will kind of highlighted on that before me, but I'll get into why you choose not to some things. Can you go to the next slide, please, Suresh? So a little bit about our farm. We were started in the fall of 1984. My parents purchased where we are in New Hartford. They kind of ebbed and flowed with things they did over the years, leading until 2021. Me and my brother purchased the farm from my parents after my father had passed away. We kind of wanted to clear the books and start fresh from some mistakes they had made in the past and stuff. And it's the way we went about it to put our vision on it. And currently we grow a little more than 130 acres of vegetables. We have a garden center where we grow, we're what's considered a grower retailer. We grow about a little more than an acre of bedding plants that we retail. We are a retail oriented farm. We used to do a lot more wholesale. And we'll get into that as we go more into our different enterprises and stuff. We currently gross a little less than $3 million a year in sales. And we've grown that number. That number has actually been growing quickly since we took over the reins. Please go to the next slide, Shrish. So we're pretty diversified. I'll get into the reasons of why in later slides, but markets is a quick way we do it. We do a couple of farmers markets still for retail. We find it's just a good diversification in the fact of we're on a busy highway where our home farm is, which is great. But in the world of the vegetable stuff, we've had many, about like once every 5 years, the state decides to pave our road. And when you have that happen, you will see a good 2 week drop off if you're lucky in sales, or longer if there's a bridge involved or something. And we like to have that location diversification, and that kind of helps. It's a good, cheap way to get started. And we're at the point we only do a few markets, and ones that are only proven to us where we know we're very certain what we're going to get out of them every season. And we're kind of stuck to the ones we're doing and not really looking for more. Value added products, we have a few different value added products we have made with our stuff. We don't process anything ourselves. I'll get into that later on. But we found that that's just a more effective way to do it. We raise meat and eggs. We raise a small amount of hogs, and we have a flock of around 700 laying hens that we keep year round. We have a CSA program. It's a pretty good sized CSA program with a little more than 500 members every year. We don't particularly cap it, but that's kind of where we try to stop advertising and not get bigger than that. Not that we'll say no, but it's just we're kind of happy with the size it's at. We do a few events. Our events are mostly oriented around the times of the year where we have not a lot going on. This way it doesn't really compete with anything in the busy time of the year, and kind of can provide a little bit more, once again, going into the diversification of different times of the year to try to drive sales and off times of the year. We grow a huge range of crops. We literally, in the greenhouse, I was actually right before this, I was meeting with one of my plant broker people who's new on the job, and and they're flabbergasted at how many different varieties of perennials and stuff we grow in our garden center side of the business. And and the reason is we're trying to, we retail everything, so we want a full display of stuff. And that's the difference between when you're more of a wholesaler. I think it's easier to be specialized than when you're a retailer. The wholesale side of our business is a shrinking side of our business, unlike Will's, but we have a little bit different range. We used to, many years ago, sell to a lot of different grocery stores and re-wholesalers, and that market is very difficult right now in Connecticut. You have so many systemic disadvantages in Connecticut with just land being too spread apart, and increased labor rates, and it's difficult to compete in a very thin margin thing. So we still do a little bit, but we only do it as to complement what we need to grow for our retail business at this point. We do some season extension stuff, mostly just early in the season with growing a little bit in some high tunnels, and we don't really pursue a late season anymore, but we used to. I should also mention, just we do a lot of partnership type things, and that's why I put a picture of that spice rack in that bottom right corner. It's just something that's made with our name on it. It's something we could easily try to do ourselves, but it's something where it's able to be produced and our label put on it just as good of a job as we could do procuring spices. And and while it's just a simple thing, it's just another thing in the grand mix of retail and the different things we do. Can you move to the next slide, please? So reasons why we diversify is, number one is business growth. I'm a sucker for growth, and that's kind of gets our head, that gets my attention. So that's one of the main reasons when we look at diversifying, it's as an opportunity to grow. Number two is risk mitigation, as was mentioned before, about whether it's through climate change stuff or just the general pains of growing in the Northeast. When you have a diversity of product and your eggs aren't all in one basket sales wise, it's good to have a backup for everything. Competitive advantage is another one. I mentioned before the million varieties of perennials that we might have, that we're trying to sell and have more variety than anybody else in our garden center. Quite frankly, it's one of the biggest draws to our garden center is you name the plant, we we should have it. And we want it to, if you are looking for something, we want you to know that you can come to us and find it. Or at least we did have it at one point. And we have that philosophy with a lot of what we do. And that's the main reason of our diversification. We've had too many times in our life growing up and stuff on a farm and living and dying by this, where one crop fails and it sinks you for the season. So that's why we try to be as diverse as possible to not allow that to happen. To test markets is another reason. We're always kind of trying to keep our eyes open on opportunities. And so often when we diversify or we're looking at diversifying, it's to test to see if it's something new we can do. And sometimes there's nothing there. Sometimes there's something good there. Number 5 is to appeal to new customers is what I could come up with on that. So when we started adding a little bit of the meat options, it actually brought in kind of a different customer into our farm stand. And it was actually somebody who spends a lot more money in one purchase than the normal vegetable customer was. All of a sudden you're having people hit the 3-digit numbers in our farm stand, it's really nice. And so that was just one advantage of the diversification, really kind of paying off and finding new people and new good customers. When we started our CSA program, we went from kind of more of just your traditional corn oriented farm stand to getting really, once again, people like a different type of customer who wasn't really interested in sweet corn so much, but they were interested in all those other vegetables. And those customers, while your sweet corn customer might come 4 times a week, these other people you might only see once or twice a week, but when they come, they're filling a bag with everything. And that's been a really good customer to attract. And that's where, that type of diversification sales really paid off. And what might be the most important, as Will was mentioning before, is just employee retention. The more diverse and year-round we can keep people and make it as close to a real job as possible in agriculture, which is a real challenge. And Pepe will said it better than I can. Before it's kind of something that's really hard to put a number on. When you find good people, it's a challenge to keep them in our industries, particularly if you're in a point when you're going to send them home for a couple months a year because you have nothing for them to do. So sometimes even if you have to put a enterprise which might be showing some loss, like as Chris had in a couple of examples, sometimes it's worth it just for that cost of retaining that employee. So that's something to always keep in mind. Next slide, please. So when do we decide to diversify? Number 1, you have to identify an opportunity. That can come in a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's as simple as somebody saying, a customer talking to you and telling you, hey, why don't you guys have this? Or, hey, I saw this at that farm. I like to, I would recommend any farmers or anybody here that is in the industry, if you have a farm stand or a garden center or anything like that, go visit other garden centers and farm stands. If you're traveling, go visit them there. That's where you get a lot of ideas. And that's the hardest part in being in business, is coming up with ideas sometimes and ways to be unique. And that uniqueness really can help your business. So number 1, we have to identify it. And then researching. I was hoping Chris would mention a SWOT analysis. I didn't know if he did or not, but so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So figure that out. And whenever you identify something, what's it going to do for you? I'm not going to get into every nitty-gritty detail of that, but it's a lot of trying to figure out what the opportunities are there and what's the risks of doing this. And without having a specific product in mind, it's hard to say specifics with that. Networking is key. Talking to other farms and other people who are similar businesses, make friends that are in a similar business to you. They don't have to be in Connecticut, though they should. You should make as many friends as you can in the business and just talk to them about things that have worked for them. Find people that are a little farther off of what you want to be. If you see somebody who's like, if you can identify a business that's 5 years ahead of where you want to be or 10 years ahead of where you want to be, find them and talk to them about, different things. And if you see somebody, if I wanted to get into making some, hard cider like Will's looking into, talk to some people who are in that business. And that's the best way to find out things that can go right and things that can go wrong. Talk to your customers. Sometimes like it's a challenge we have. It's where I get jealous sometimes of some smaller farms, because as we've gotten bigger, it's harder and harder for me to have a pulse with my direct customers. So I have to trust and empower employees to do this. And, and when you get to a size of like our business or bigger, you have to develop systems so this way that customers are getting back to you in what they're looking for. A lot of times, and quite frankly, most of the diversification we've gone into has been because of stuff we've heard from customers. But before you make a big investment, get a pulse of who's your customers are, because sometimes you can get an easy no or an easy yes. Then once you finally get the idea, if you want to do something, budget it off, and see if you can actually make money doing this. It's very, numbers don't lie. I can't speak enough to the value of numbers. If you look in the background, we use QuickBooks Online, and not my background, but if you could see my other tabs I have open, there's a QuickBooks Online tab pretty much open all the time. And we're keeping track of every single thing we can. We probably don't go as in depth as Chris would like me to. But we do our best, and it's made a big difference in our business's profitability, really crunching those numbers. And the last one I can't harp on enough is consider alternatives. So like, we have a tomato sauce that's made from our tomatoes that we sell. I could, originally, before we knew about the co-packing opportunities we have, you would think that you should try to make this yourself, and you could never compete. Like, it's really, I mean, you can, but it's like, it's just not possible to, price wise and everything. When you really weigh it all out, like, no one really cares if you're the one making this tomato sauce. They just want it to taste good and actually have your tomatoes in it. And if you can accomplish that by using somebody else to make it, that's a great alternative to sinking $1 million into a kitchen. So, always consider alternatives, and whatever it is. And, when you start looking at different crops, like we've gotten to this in our greenhouse where, there's several crops where we're kind of capped out in the amount of greenhouse space we can produce due to our farmland preservation bubble. So it's really hard for us to add crops. So we're actually at the point in that business where we're cutting crops, and we're just deciding that I can't grow a good Rieger begonia, so I'm going to let Jeremiah Farms in Wallingford grow it, or whatever, and I'll buy that in because it's cheaper for me to buy that in than try to grow a crop that I can't grow as well. And so, that's a good alternative for us, and we're lucky to be in that position. And last of all, make your decisions, be decisive, make decisions, and stick to them. Pass to the next slide, please. So just some thoughts kind of to wrap it all up.
They're on milk and cheeses too. Holy smokes.
The complement versus compete, that's a thing we're always looking at. People have a limited dollar they're coming into your store with, and that kind of gets into what I was talking about before with choosing what to grow. And when we're making all these choices to grow in the field and stuff like that, it's what really matters, what's actually just complementing everything, what goes together, what doesn't, having 20 different types of something that you really only need one for, that type of thing. Cash flow is really important. While Farm Credit does offer convenient operating lines and terms, pretty much the whole sales pitch to like a CSA, and the most alluring part of it is the cash flow component. Is me receiving money in January for several hundred CSA members is a lot cheaper than an operating line. And when you can, that's the CSA is probably the ultimate example of how, like in a vegetable oriented business, you can really kind of figure out cash flow and really help your cash flow. And it allows us to ramp up earlier, which helps us, expand the market. It really kind of all flows together. Know when to say no. There's a lot of opportunities out there, admittedly, as Will very properly mentioned, we only produce 2% of our food. So if you're on the food side of this, there's a lot of opportunity, but not all of those opportunities are profitable. Not all of them are opportunities that are going to work. We get a lot of, I've been around long enough where I've seen a lot of people fail, and a lot of it is not knowing when to say no. In our business, we've been, some of the most profitable decisions we've made have been saying no to something we've been doing for 10 years or 20 years. Number 4, less can be more. I can't harp on this enough. It's a mentality we all struggle with in agriculture. I think we are a little better at it than some others. I was just sitting next to a couple dairy producers at a farm credit meeting, last week. And it's kind of the joke of, there's a philosophy in both dairy and commodity farming of, if the price is good, you add more and grow more. If the price is bad, you grow more to try to overcome it. And that's not necessarily the best opportunity. Sometimes, there's just some simple math you can do of, if you sell 50 of something at $100, versus selling, whatever of something at $20, it's sometimes easier to grow the $50 item. And, it's better for your personal life, and it's better than anything. Number 5 is just value your time. A lot of people in this business do not value their time at all. And the fact that you're here means you're kind of interested in this stuff, and that's good. Just be sure whenever you're figuring this stuff out, when you're doing your budgets and stuff, put a very high value on your personal time. And it's okay if it takes some struggle to get something started. That's fine, and it's good. But once it's settled, if you're exerting a ton of energy, make sure you're getting paid for it. Number 6 is empower employees. I can't speak enough. It's something I pride myself in as a manager, an overall manager of this business, of letting our employees, really have power to do in things that, make decisions, and you discuss it with them. It doesn't mean you just let them go for, free willy, but you really just let them do what they need to do. And last of all, be unique. The more unique you can be, the more, special your place is, and people will come to you. That's about it.
Okay, thank you so much, Bruce, Will, and Chris. We are at the end of the hour. If you are willing to stay for a couple more minutes, and if we have questions from our audience, we can address that. Okay.
There's one in the chat, Suresh.
Yeah. Chris, you mentioned getting buy-in from employees on record keeping. Wondering how Bruce and Will went about getting buy-in and setting up systems to maintain the accuracy of numbers.
Well, I'll start with that. It's difficult to do, admittedly. It's much easier on my retail side. With point of sale, it's more of a technology question on the point of sale side. On the production side, we're looking at trying to make this a little better, and we're trying to introduce some technology to help that as well. It's on my side, particularly, it's been through managers and understanding what we're doing with these numbers, and just explaining to them, this is what I'm doing with this. This is why it does suck to have to do this way, but we need this number to do this. And once they understand what it is they're doing, it gets them there.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think now, all of our point of sale stuff is digital. You can set up really good systems for record keeping just by making sure that your inputs into those point of sale systems and in your chart of accounts on QuickBooks Online are accurate and sort of speaking to each other. So that's something that we've done a bit of on our own, and then it's appropriate that I think it was Shirlene that asked the question. The Carrot Project helped us set up a lot of that as well, which is where Shirlene works. And so as far as on the sales side, both for wholesale and retail markets, like that part's pretty easy now and drives a lot of our decision making, and our employees don't even really have to think about it. The production side is the harder piece, and I think, yeah, it's about empowering our, assistant farm manager and having her and the two of us all on the same page so that employees understand the systems they're implementing. If they're looking at our, spreadsheets for the greenhouse or for a planting calendar or whatever, it's all, clear and allows them to sort of plug and play and also adapt if needed.
Bruce, you mentioned test markets,
Yeah. So
examples.
the one specific example I will give is one where it led to a no, in the grand scope of things we were considering expanding in. In particular, it pertained to Thanksgiving turkeys. I don't know if test markets was necessarily the right way to say it, but I did a test for 2 seasons of wholesale purchasing local turkeys from another farm, that were slaughtered and processed, and just to see how my demand would be, to get the ideas of, like, it's one of those things where I wanted to, like, I had a certain amount of turkeys I thought I would need to sell to be profitable and figure out the processing. And so we did a pre-sign up thing. And after doing all this stuff with it, I decided it wasn't worth the headache, for what the profit would be. The demand wasn't quite as strong as I thought it would be. And we were about as high on the price side as we could be. And I just didn't see it. So that was my test. I don't know if the test market was the appropriate term, but it was that's what I put.
Yeah.
That's what I had in mind. I've had it with a few other things with, like, plants and stuff like that, where we'll do a trial of something before we grow it, of just trying to buy some in to see, like, what the demand is, and that's mostly what I've used testing for, in that terms of just trying to see, like, yeah, are people, like, really interested in this? And most of the time it's usually been a no when I've gone down this path, but there's been a few in the plant world in particular where it's like, okay, we should have been doing this for a long time. Good thing we tested it.
Yeah, with that, I'd like to thank you all so much for joining, and thank you, Chris, Will, and Bruce, for excellent presentations. Before participants log off, I would encourage you to take a minute or so to fill out the form. If you fill it out now, we don't have to follow up, bother you with email. It only takes most 2 minutes. So please fill it out, and thank you so much. It's in the chat. With that, I thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Suresh.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Chris put his email address, and in our follow-up email, we will include that as well.
Thank you. And can we get a copy of the slide as well?
So this presentation is recorded, and we'll post it on our website with the
Perfect.
PDF of the slides.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
So I'll stop recording.
What is the website, by the way?
This is going to be at Yukon Extension IPM website, and there is a specific events page, and